what do you do with the people? And this is when the two-state solution came about. The Israelis said, we know what, you are already aware that the Zionist movement is in love with partition. They like to divide. They said, let's do partition in the West Bank as well. Let's divide the West Bank. This was the idea of one of the great strategists of Israel after 1967. His name was Ilan. I don't know if you heard the name. And he had a plan called the Ilan plan, which was the blueprint for all the Israeli policies after 1967. Ilan said, let's divide the West Bank into two parts. One part is a part which has to be under direct Israeli rule. And he had a map. He said exactly which part. He said the Jordan Valley has for always to be Israel. You know why? Because there's this huge river that takes Israel. So we need, but because the river is not so big, we need the whole valley as well just to be on the safe side. So we need the Jordan, by the way, the Jordan Valley is 30% of the West Bank. So once you take out the Jordan Valley from the West Bank, not much is left of the West Bank. Then they said, another part we want is Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, right? Now they did a little trick with Jerusalem. They said Jerusalem is not Jerusalem, it's Greater Jerusalem. Greater Jerusalem is like amoeba. Every year it grows. I don't know why, but most of the maps in my atlas don't move. Well, one map that moves in my atlas is the map of Greater Jerusalem. If you're not careful, Praze would be part of Greater Jerusalem. It grows all the time. All the time the Israelis change the municipal boundaries of Greater Jerusalem. Maybe you are already citizens of Greater Jerusalem for all we know. And it's now 1/3 of the West Bank. So we took 1/3 in the Jordan Valley. We took 1/3 of the Greater Jerusalem. And then, but that happened a bit later, when the Jewish settlers came, the Israelis invented another area that has to be Israel. And you are familiar with it. This is called the settlement blocks. The settlement blocks are not settlements, really. They're proper cities that Israel built near the border that used to be between the West Bank and Israel. And they said, you know, it's so close to Israel anyway, so let's annex it anyway, right? So now, and they are about 15%. And I don't know how you are in mathematics, but if you take the Jordan Valley, the Greater Jerusalem area, the big settlement blocks, and you come to the Palestinians, as they did in the Oslo Accord, and they said, we, Israel, the Zionist movement, we are the most generous people on earth. Nobody, even the Czech, are not as generous as we are. We offer you in the rest of the West Bank a state. The Palestinians make clear, not much is left. They said, okay, it's better than nothing, so we'll take it. I mean, like, what else do we have? I don't think the Israelis meant the Palestinians to take it. They were surprised when the Palestinians said yes. So they invented a new thing, as you noticed. And that thing is called the myth that there's no one to talk to. Because if Israel was about to implement even its generous offer, it would have run into trouble inside Israel with ideological movements in Israel, and the whole idea that you are not supposed to give the Palestinians a state. You're supposed to give them kind of an autonomy, maybe, in the areas which Israel is not interested in, right? And I think the fact that the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinians under occupation, in the second Intifada, in the second uprising, felt that, even without a calculator, they felt that this is not worth the paper it's written on as a solution, as the end of the conflict, as a settlement for the problem. And they rose against this idea in the second Intifada. The Israelis said, okay, now there's another problem. This is today. We are taking out from the future Palestinian state the Jordan Valley, the Greater Jerusalem area, the big settlement blocks, but we have to punish you for the second Intifada and the way you behaved since the second Intifada. So we're adding some additional blocks to the settlement blocks. The Israelis have a word for this. It's called the natural growth of the settlement. The natural growth is like the amoeba of the Greater Jerusalem area. It grows all the time. Whether there is a natural growth or not, it doesn't matter. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that in 1967, Israel created a formula that for the outside world and for good people around the world looked reasonable, and I can understand it. And that was called the two-state solution. So on the face of it, the idea that Israel withdraws from the West Bank and from the Gaza Strip does not allow any Jew to settle there, and allows the Palestinian to develop a Palestinian statehood. Even if you are not a great believer in such concept, you could say, you know what, that's a beginning. That's a beginning, and you can see why quite a lot of people in the Arab world, people in the Palestinian communities, definitely people who lived under occupation, but you know, some great people, like people, conscientious people. One of them was here, I understand, maybe in this room, Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky. Why so many people were mesmerized by this idea? Because on the face of it, they said, it's a positive step forward. I think what they ignored is that words do not create reality. Bulldozers do. Armies do. Words do not create reality. And if you study Zionism as well as I did, and you understand that the two-state solution from a Zionist perspective is not a two-state solution. It's a solution for the problem they created themselves in 1967. They want the territories without the people. They want the territories without the people, but they don't want to appear as a criminal state while doing it. So you create a peace process that doesn't go anywhere. So you say, we are thinking about this two-state solution, but the facts on the ground make it impossible. So I think it's however you think about the two-state solution, and I know we have in the movement of solidarity with the Palestinians, in Israel, in Palestine, we have a debate. It's a legitimate debate, whether we should continue to support the two-state solution, whether we should try something new and support the one-state solution. I think that's a legitimate debate, and I think it should continue. I think it's an important debate. But before you do the debate, what I don't like to hear, and that's my disagreement with my good friend Noam Chomsky, and that's why we wrote the book together about it, because I disagree with him. Don't say that there is an Israeli position that supports the two-state solution. I think that's not true. You can be for a two-state solution, but you have to be aware that the stronger party in this conflict, the people who have the keys to the car, do not believe in a two-state solution. And I'm not talking about the right wing in Israel. I'm talking about the center and the left. What they believe is a two-state will never satisfy even the most moderate, submissive Palestinian. And that's important to understand. From an Israeli perspective, the Oslo Accord was not meant to create a two-state solution. It was meant to get an international recognition for the arrangement that they have found in 1967 for how to have the territories without having the people. They divided the West Bank into two parts. They gave the Palestinians, as always, the smaller part. They said in the smaller part you can have a flag, you can have a president, you can even call it a state if you know, we don't mind. You can call it a state. But we have the right to enter that state with our army to arrest people whenever we want. We can take part of that state and annex it if we find it necessary. We control all the water resources of this state. We collect the taxes for this state. I checked in all the books in the world. Never did I find a sovereign state that someone else has collect the taxes for them. Where?
Nicaragua, 1905.
Really? Yeah, well, I'm not surprised. That's not a very inspiring example. You know, the whole idea is how you, the Palestinians, can help us to implement our idea. Now, maybe, and I can understand it, if you live in a certain part of occupied, the West Bank, you say, it's better like that than it was under direct occupation. I'm not sure, but I'm not the one to say this. I'm living under Israeli occupation. And all these are, again, legitimate views. What I'm saying is, it's time to understand and with this I would end before I will just say a few words of how we move forward. But it's time to understand that whatever you call Israel, whether you're talking about the government of Israel, whether you talk about the Israeli parliament, whether you talk about the Israeli academia, whether you talk about the Israeli media, I think it's very important to understand there is no voice inside Israel that really believes in a two-state solution. They believe in the continuation of the brilliant solution they found in 1967, by which the Palestinians are closed in small areas, they control the rest, and if the world is willing to call it a solution, that would be wonderful. If the world is not willing to call it a solution, let's talk about the peace process that will call it a solution, but nothing is going to change fundamentally. Israel is going to be present on the Jordan River, it is going to be present in Hebron, it will be present in the ever-growing Greater Jerusalem area, it will be present in the Jordan Valley, and if you look at the map with a magnifying glass, you will find the space where the Palestinians can live under this solution. And this is not a right-wing perception. This is a consensual Israeli perception. The present government of Israel has is made of political parties that all in one way or another subscribe to this idea. Maybe one or two voices in the parliament do not, but the government as a whole subscribe, and the government represents 90% of the Jewish people. Now, this is the analysis. You may share this analysis, you may not. What is the prognosis? And I have another 5 minutes?
10 minutes?
No, I don't know. I'm a historian. My prognosis are short. My analysis are very long. Other people should do the prognosis. For me, there are three conclusions, if you accept my analysis. Of course, I have to warn you, not everybody accepts my analysis, and when I make these analyses in Israel, I have to go and teach in England. So I want you to be clear about this. But there is, if you accept at least in major part this analysis, there are three major conclusions. One is that without strong outside pressure on Israel, Israeli policies will not change. No peace process like Oslo or whatever is going to replace Oslo is going to bear fruits of any kind. Definitely not two-state solution. Because a peace process is not pressure on Israel. A peace process assumes that both sides want genuinely to find a reconciliation. It's utterly wrong to assume that about the state of Israel. It uses peace processes to perpetuate the occupation. Now, if you want to help Israel to perpetuate the occupation, go to the Israeli embassy. They have these little boxes. You can donate some Czech money. They prefer dollars, I think, but it doesn't matter. And you can help them. But supporting the peace process is not supporting the peace process. Supporting the peace process provides Israel immunity to continue with its impunity. That's my first conclusion. And that's why I supported so much the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction. I really believe, like in the case of South Africa, you need the international community, the conscious people of the international community, to say to Israel, enough is enough. It's a non-violent means. I don't believe in violence. Don't misunderstand me. It's a non-violent means that sends a message to Israel from the civilized world, which Israel wants very much to belong to. If you continue to do what you do, you cannot be a member of the civilized world. There's a price to be paid if you want to be counted in the civilized world. Now, of course, they can come to Prague and think that the civilized world is behind them. But Prague is not the whole world. And maybe also Prague would one day send Israel a clear message that Israel is not part of the civilized world. You have a mission here. The second conclusion is that you have to think about a new political solution that would allow Jews and Palestinians to live together in the land of Palestine. Because all these old ideas of two states are not going to work. That doesn't mean that they have a magic formula. You talked about Brit Shalom. They thought about a binational state. I like more the idea of a democratic state. I'm not particularly in love with nationalism myself. But it doesn't really matter. I think what matters at this point is not so much what is the solution, but who is legitimate partner in discussing the solution. Are the Palestinian refugees a legitimate partner? If they are, then let us hear us saying that they have the right to discuss their return to their homes. And then you have a different kind of discussion. What kind of political outfit would be able to provide equal rights to three groups? To three groups. The native local Palestinians who were always in Palestine. The Zionist Jews who came, they came as a settler colonialist movement. Now there's already a third generation. I don't think a third generation is not allowed to stay. I think a lot of Palestinians realize it. Even if you're a third generation of, like I am, of a settler colonialist, you are now part of the land. You were born there, your parents were born there. It's ridiculous to think that you can throw them out as well. So this group also has to be integrated. And the group that was expelled, the refugees. You don't have to be a genius to find out the new frame in which people should live together on the basis of equal rights, whether they are locals, refugees, or the third generation. You know what? Even if they came from Prague 2 weeks ago to be part of the State of Israel, they could be integrated. Contrary to all the mythologies that you hear, there is space for everyone. There's plenty of space in Palestine. You can divide the resources between everyone. You just have to have the political will to accept everyone as an equal. If you don't accept everyone as an equal, resources become a problem. Space becomes a problem. But if you accept everyone as an equal, then you can build something else. And the third conclusion, and with this I will end, is that there has to be, and I know it would be very, very painful for the Israelis. Very, very. I'm not eluding myself. But the Israelis would have to go through the same process that the whites in South Africa went through. And it was, believe me, it was painful for the whites in South Africa. You don't need all the Israelis to go through that process. When apartheid fell in South Africa, most of the whites in South Africa were still racists. It's not that every white in South Africa suddenly was anti-apartheid when apartheid fell. I suspect the vast majority of them were still for apartheid. But a small enough number, or a large enough number, began to reread the historical situation. And when you reread the historical situation, and you say, we came here, maybe for good reasons, that's okay. The problem is not our reasons. We came here because we wanted to come here, and we felt that this was our homeland, no problem with that. But there was someone else here. And we expelled the persons who lived here, the people who lived there. And we were not unique in it. White people, when they were pushed out of Europe, pushed the non-white people from wherever they came. There's nothing new in this. Now, if you want to have reconciliation, you have to start with this point. You have to start with this point. Then you can come to the Palestinians. You can even come to the Arab world. You can come to the Muslim world and say, stop talking about us not being part of the land. We are part of the land. Don't tell Mr. Ahmadinejad to talk that we're not going back to Germany. Okay. But in order to have this kind of conversation with the local people, saying now it's time to explain that we are here and you are here and we are reframing our relationship, you have to accept that you were not here before. Now I'm a member of the Israeli Academia, I'm a former member of the Israeli Academia. But I must tell you the amount of money and energy we invested in order to prove that we were always there. You could have built 5 hospitals. You could have built 3 bridges of peace between Israel and Palestine instead of all the money that went. And the weakest nation nowadays, the Palestinians, you don't have a more imbalance of power, in military power, economic power, political power. And despite the fact that Israel is so strong and the Palestinians are so weak, the only people who can really give Israel legitimacy are the Palestinians. And that drives the Israelis mad. It drives them mad. The Americans say you are legitimate. The Europeans say you are legitimate. Every nation from Micronesia to Macronesia says you are legitimate. Do whatever you want, especially if you give us some money. The only people who can really say to the Jews, you're welcome in Palestine. You can be part of the Middle East, and not even the Arab world. That's where the mistake of the Muslim movements around the Arab world. They think that they have the agency. They don't have the agency. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt cannot determine whether I can live in Israel or not. But the Palestinians can. They can, unless I will exterminate everyone. But as long as there's one Palestinian alive, he would need to give me legitimacy. And that drives them mad. They can build 250 nuclear weapons. They can have great technology, and they have. Really, they have. And they have friends in Prague. But they need Abdullah in Nablus to say, Ya Habibi, ibka hum.